Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Western Canon Challenge, where we are reading the entirety of the Western Literary Canon out loud. Today we begin and complete journal collection number 63. It is one of the shorter of the journal collections, just barely over 20 pages, I believe, and it dates from the year 1872, and Emerson will turn 69 years old in this year. That said, I will read the biographical editorial update. In January, Mr. Emerson gave a course of 4 lectures in Baltimore, and at Washington, where he was the guest of Senator Sumner, was asked to speak to the students, freedmen, of Howard University. The address was partly extempore, but he probably, to help out the address, read them some sheets from his lecture on books, to guide the reading of the more earnest and intellectual among them. The occasion was reported in all the papers, and after his return, Mr. Emerson was almost annoyed, but soon rather amused by the many letters which he received. He told his family that the speech was, quote, very poor, merely talking against time, end quote. In the course of it he praised George Herbert's poems as a Sunday book and a Monday book too, asked if it were in the library, and said he should have the privilege of giving it to them. When he went to the bookstore in Boston to buy it, he was told, "There isn't a Herbert to be had, sir. Since your speech was published, there has been such a demand for them that they are all sold out, and none left in Boston." However, he found one, and came home better pleased with the result of his speech than he had ever thought to be. Then more letters came, one suggesting that he should write on the subject of books. Comparatively few persons had probably then read Society and Solitude, the volume published nearly 2 years before. Mr. James T. Fields, who with Colonel Forbes had arranged the Saturday afternoon readings of English prose and verse in 1869, again kindly bestirred himself, Colonel Forbes having gone to Europe with his family, to have such another course. This plan was most successful, and the tickets were in great demand for the 6 readings in Mechanics' Hall, Boston, beginning in the middle of April. Mr. Emerson enjoyed sharing with an audience of friends, old and young, the pleasure that he had in these selections made from his boyhood on. The poems and selections were of authors of various periods and on widely differing themes. Mr. Emerson read his favorites, whether recent or dear from the associations of his youth, not caring greatly whether all were illustrations of the short discourse at the beginning. As his memory was now imperfect, he once, at least, read a sheet which he had already read a few minutes before. His daughter Ellen, who had always accompanied him, was troubled at this and begged him always to read his lectures to her in advance. But he answered, "Things that go wrong about these lectures don't disturb me, because I know that everyone knows that I am worn out and passed by, and that it is only my old friends come for friendship's sake to have one last season with me." The course, however, seems to have been very successful, and to have given great pleasure week by week to a large number of the best of Boston and the neighborhood. What follows may have been some notes for the last of these readings, or possibly for some Sunday address to the Parker Society at the Music Hall. End of note. 'Tis becoming in the Americans to dare in religion to be simple, as they have been in government, in trade, in social life. Christianity is pure deism. Hunger and thirst after righteousness. The kingdom of God cometh not by observation, is received as a little child. God considers integrity, not munificence. Socrates. Power belongeth unto God, but his secret is with them that fear him. Schleiermacher said, "The human soul is by nature a Christian." One thing is certain, the religious are obsolete when the reforms do not proceed from them. You say the Church is an institution of God. Yes, but are not wit and wise men and good judgment, whether a thing be so or no, also institutions of God, and older than the other? Concord, Lyceum. For that local lecture, which I still propose to read at our town hall, remember to speak concerning the hanging of private pictures, each for 1 month, in the library, etc., etc. Remember that a scholar wishes that every book, chart, and plate belonging to him should draw interest every moment by circulation. For no man is the lord of anything till he communicate his part to others, nor doth he of himself know them for aught till he behold them formed in the applause, where they're extended, where like an arch reverberates. The voice again, or like of a gate of steel, fronting the sun, receives and renders back the figure and its heat. Troilus and Cressida. When a boy, I used to go to the wharves and pick up shells out of the sand which vessels had brought as ballast, and also plenty of stones, gypsum, which I discovered would be luminous when I rubbed two bits together in a dark closet, to my great wonder. And I do not know why luminous to this day. That and the magnetizing my penknife till it would hold a needle, and the fact that blue and gamboge would make green in my pictures of mountains, and the charm of drawing vases by scrawling with ink heavy random lines, and then doubling the paper so as to make another side symmetrical. What was chaos becoming symmetrical. Then helloing to an echo at the pond and getting wonderful replies. Still earlier, what silent wonder is waked in the boy by blowing bubbles from soap and water with a pipe? Old age. We spend a great deal of time in waiting. No more I seek, the prize is found. I furl my sail, the voyage is o'er. Whose lines? Mine, I believe, part of translation of some Latin lines from Mrs. Drury. The good writer is sure of his influence, because, as he is always copying not from his fancy, but from real facts, when his reader afterwards come to like experiences of his own, he is always reminded of the writer. Nor do I much care for the question whether the Zendavesta or the Deserteur are genuine antiques or modern counterfeits, as I am only concerned with the good sentences, and it is indifferent how old a truth is, whether an hour or 5 centuries, whether it is first shot into the mind of Adam or your own. If it be truth, it's certainly much older than both of us. Shakespeare. Parallax, as you know, is the apparent displacement of an object from two points of view, less and less of the heavenly bodies because of their remoteness, and of the fixed stars none at all. Well, it is thus that we have found Shakespeare to be a fixed star, because all sorts of men have in 3 centuries found him still unapproachable. The merit of a poem is decided by long experience. May 26th, 1872. Yesterday, my 69th birthday, I found myself on my round of errands in Summer Street, and though close on the spot where I was born, was looking into a street with some bewilderment, and read on the sign, Kingston Street, with surprise, finding in the granite blocks no hint of Nathaniel Goddard's pasture and long wooden fence, and so of my nearness to my native corner of Chauncey Place. It occurred to me that a few living persons ought to know so much of the families of this fast-growing city, for the reason that Aunt Mary, whose manuscripts I have been reading to Hedge and Bartle on Friday evening, had such a keen perception of character and taste for aristocracy, and I heard in my youth and manhood every name she knew. It is now nearly 100 years since she was born, and the founders of the oldest families that are still notable were known to her as retail merchants, milliners, tailors, distillers, as well as the ministers, lawyers, and doctors of the time. She was a realist, and knew a great man or a whale-hearted woman, as she called one of her pets, from a successful money-maker. If I should live another year, I think I shall cite still the last stanza of my poem, The World's Soul. Walk in the city for an hour, and you shall see the whole history of female beauty. Here are the schoolgirls in the profusion of their hair covering them to the waist, and now and then one maiden of 18 or 19 years in the moment of her perfect beauty. Look quickly and sharply, this is her one meridian day. To find the like again, you must meet, on your next visit, one who is a month younger today. Then troops of pleasing, well-dressed ladies, sufficiently good-looking and graceful, but without claims to the prize of the goddess of discord. No sign that our mighty rocks had ever tingled with earthquake, said John Muir. He said he slept in a wrinkle of the bark of a sequoia on the night after we left him. June 12th. Sarah Clark gratified us with her visit of 26 hours, ever the same peaceful, wise, just, and benevolent spirit, open, gentle, skilful, without a word of self-assertion. I regret that I did not recall and testify to her my oft recollection of her noble and oft needed and repeated sisterly aid to Margaret Fuller, in old times, in her cruel headaches. We talked of many friends of both of us, but of Charles Newcomb it seems she knew nothing. Of Greenough she did not know much. I was glad, in describing his last visit to me, to add that he was one to whom his varied perception added the rare one of, and then there's a Greek word, and then parentheses, the dire. What proof of Goethe's wealth of mind like the Spruch? July 11th. Yesterday read my paper on Character, or Greatness to the Social Union, comprising the 4 classes at Amherst College. Stayed with Ellen at President Stearns's house, there finding Henry Ward Beecher, Judge Lord, and other gentlemen, with Miss Gleason, Miss Goodman of Lenox, Miss Annie Lee of Charlestown, and the daughters of President Stearns. Visited the Boltwoods, and with Professor Charles U. Shepard, went through his rich collection of minerals in the Walker Hall. 'Tis easy to write the techniques of poetry, to discriminate imagination and fancy, etc., but the office and power which that word poetry covers and suggests are not so easily reached and defined. What heaven and earth and sea and the forms of men and women are speaking or hinting to us in our healthiest and most impressionable hours. What fresh perceptions a new day will give us of the old problems of our own being and its hidden source. What is this sky of law, and what the future hides? Wednesday, July 24th. House burned. Editor's note. The above is all the record that Mr. Emerson left of the temporary destruction of his home. By unhappy chance, not one of their children was at hand to help their father and mother when on a rainy morning they were waked by the crackling of fire in the walls of their room. Their daughter Ellen was visiting friends at the seashore. Mrs. Forbes, Edith, was with her husband and family on the homeward voyage from England, and Edward, then convalescent from a surgical operation, had remained there to pursue his medical studies. But the immediate neighbors, and soon a great number of the townspeople as well as the fire company, were quickly on the spot, men and boys with great energy and courage, saving property and fighting the fire, and women and girls sorting and gathering the household goods intelligently and quickly, and saving them from the rain by carrying them to the houses nearby. The occurrence at a fire in a village and the actions of kind-hearted but inexperienced neighbors have been a stock subject for ridicule in newspapers and stories, but here was an occasion when good sense and brave and affectionate neighborly action reached a high water mark, and never did the town family, as it used to exist in simpler days, and still in a measure remains, show forth more finely. The fire originated in the attic, almost surely from a kerosene lamp charring the timbers hot and dry from the summer. A woman, engaged the day before for domestic service, had apparently spent a part of the night in prowling among the chests and trunks there. When help began to arrive, the house was filling with choking black smoke, making it hard to save furniture and clothing upstairs. By the time this was done, and the falling ceilings drove out the men, the lower stories were so filled with smoke that when the books in Mr. Emerson's study were remembered, they were felt there by brave boys, who rushed in, holding their breath, and pulled them out into baskets and blankets, and all were saved, happily the manuscripts also. Mr. and Mrs. Emerson, imperfectly clothed, wet by the rain, fatigued, and worn by excitement, were taken home and cared for by Judge Keyes and his family, and the next day were welcomed to the manse, the ancestral home, dear to Mr. Emerson from his boyhood, by his cousin, Miss Elizabeth Ripley. All sorts of exciting and some dangerous incidents occurred during the fire. When a hole chopped in through the roof let out the smoke and let in the water which put out the fire, the roof and the top of the walls of the main house were ruined and the interior greatly damaged by smoke and water. Mr. Cabot, in the memoir, gives some account of the fire and its effects on Mr. Emerson, and he also prints in Appendix E of the second volume Dr. Le Baron Russell's moving story of the friendly conspiracy, the instant and unsolicited action of friends old and new, some of them hardly known to Mr. Emerson, in testimony of affection and gratitude, to rebuild his house and send him abroad for rest and recreation meanwhile. There also in Judge Hoar's letter to Dr. Russell appears the judge's happy and affectionate wit in presenting the matter to Mr. Emerson as ambassador of his friends in such a way that the gift was impossible to refuse, though Mr. Emerson pleaded for time to consider it, saying that thus far in life he, quote, had been allowed to stand on his own feet, end quote. Mr. Emerson seemed brave and cheerful during the fire, and for more than a week afterwards it looked as if he had suffered no harm. His daughter wrote that it did not seem as if that experience would seriously affect him. There is no doubt, she wrote, that it was a tragedy to him at the time, and that he suffered very much. Nothing ever showed me so distinctly how faithful he is never to mention himself as this week has. A room in the courthouse was secured for Mr. Emerson, to which his manuscripts and needed books were brought, and there he tried to work at the anxious and unwelcome task of preparing a new volume. This had been forced upon him by an English publishing house, who otherwise proposed to print earlier scattered works of his from the Dial and elsewhere, but they consented to desist if in a very short time he would let them, in connection with his Boston publishers, bring out in England a new volume of his essays. But about a fortnight after the fire, Mr. Emerson began to be very unwell, and though he kept about a low feverish condition, with cough and weakness came on. Growing no better, he went for a day or two to Rye Beach with his daughter, and thence to Waterford, Maine. Improvement came slowly. He was distressed about the urgency of the publishers for the new volume on which he was quite unable to work. At Waterford he began to think that possibly the end of his life might be at hand, and to consider what would become of his manuscripts and journals, saying that if his son were a scholar they would be most valuable to him. Otherwise they are worthless. He dreaded their falling into the hands of the wrong persons. His friend Mr. J. Elliott Cabot and Dr. Frederick H. Hedge were the only persons that he would consider, but he did not feel that he could task either of them to leave their work for his, should his powers fail. It was explained to the publishers in London and here that it was absolutely out of the question for Mr. Emerson to do any work upon letters and social aims until he had recovered his health by entire rest. Next year, Mr. Cabot most kindly arranged the material for it and prepared it for the press. Not long after the fire, Miss Emerson wrote to Dr. Edward H. Clarke, whom her father was about to consult, a letter telling of the failure of his memory and working powers, which now the family began to realize had been imperceptibly coming on him for 5 or 6 years. Mr. Emerson had calmly recognized this in 1866 when he wrote Terminus. The fire and subsequent illness had increased this trouble, and now aphasia, the difficulty of associating the fit word to the idea, appeared, though not at first seriously, and also being very variable according to the state of his health. Norway, Maine, August 20th. Forgot on leaving home 20 necessities. Forgot to put Horace or Martial or Cicero's letters, La Cite Antique, or Taine's England in my wallet. Forgot even the sacred chocolate satchel itself, to hold them or their like. Well, at the dear Vale, 11 miles off yet, I may recall or invoke things as good. Yet I should there remember that letters are due, ... and then it says in editor's note, to many dear friends who had joined in the generous provision for restoring the house and giving a restful vacation. Perhaps I will venture on a letter of proposals of a voyage to Elliott Cabot, and a letter to the kindly Alexander Ireland is more than due. Editor's note. Colonel William Forbes and his wife and children had returned from abroad, and Mr. Emerson, now recovered from his acute attack, joyfully accepted his daughter's invitation to spend a month with them on the Forbes' beautiful island, Mrs. Emerson and their daughter Ellen going too. Nashon, August 31st. I thought today in these rare seaside woods that if absolute leisure were offered me, I should run to the college or the scientific school which offered best lectures on geology, chemistry, minerals, botany, and seek to make the alphabets of those sciences clear to me. How could leisure or labor be better employed? 'Tis never late to learn them, and every secret opened goes to authorize our aesthetics. Cato learned Greek at 80 years, but these are older Bibles and oracles than Greek. Certainly this were a good pis aller if Eliot Cabot in Athens and Egypt should prove an abortive dream. I think one must go to the tropics to find any match to this enchanting Isle of Prospero. It needs and ought to find its Shakespeare. What dells, what lakelets, what groves, what clumps of historic trees of unknown age, hinting annals of white men and Indians, histories of fire and of storm, and of peaceful ages of social growth. Nature shows her secret wonders, and seems to have impressed her fortunate landlords with instant and constant respect for her solitudes and centennial growths. Where else do such oaks and beeches and vines grow, which the winds and the storms seem rather to adorn than spoil by their hurts and devastations, touching them as with fate, and not wanton interference? And the sea binds the paradise with its grand belt of blue, with its margin of beautiful pebbles, with its watching herons and hawks and eagles, and its endless fleet of barks, steamers, yachts, and fishers' boats. The island compels them, glad to be compelled, to be skilful sailors, yachtsmen, fishermen, and swimmers, thus adding all the charm of the sea to their abode, and adds the surprise and romance of hunting. Editor's Note: It was not quite easy to persuade Mr. Emerson to go abroad for the winter and spring. The thought of seeing a few friends, old and new, in England attracted him, but he always held himself as unfit for visiting and society, and now the limitations of growing infirmities of age were mortifying. Yet the thought of seeing the ancient Nile, and perhaps Greece, drew him, and at last he was persuaded to sail, in the last week in October, with his daughter Ellen, for Liverpool, leaving Mrs. Emerson with their daughter Mrs. Forbes. Mr. and Miss Emerson were met on arriving in England by his son Edward, then a student at St. Thomas's Hospital in London, whither, after a short rest at Chester, they went early in November. Edward then had to sail for home. Mr. Emerson and his daughters were most affectionately welcomed on their arrival in London, and ever delicate aid and guidance was given them by American friends who should be here mentioned. Colonel Henry Lee, who had in the winter lost two of his daughters by diphtheria in Florence, whose wife was ill, and his oldest son then struggling between life and death with typhoid fever, yet came daily to see them, and keeping back his own troubles, cheered them with his friendly and witty talk. Mr. Charles Eliot Norton, who within a year had lost his beautiful wife, was then resident in London with his family, and gave help and wise counsel as to planning the trip to France and Italy on the way to Egypt. His sister, too, gave sisterly help to Miss Emerson, who was temporarily lame. Reverend William Henry Channing, then a Unitarian preacher in Kensington, with affectionate zeal did everything possible to make their stay in London and their invalid condition easy and pleasant, as did also Mr. Moncure D. Conway, then minister of the South Place Ethical Society. Mr. Emerson had also the unexpected pleasure of meeting Charles K. Newcomb, the valued friend of many years ago. Of English friends, first came Mr. Thomas Hughes, then Dean Stanley, and Lady Augusta, his wife, the admirable surgeon, soon after knighted, William McCormick, who had taken care of young Emerson, and, best valued, Carlyle, though old and broken and sad. In Chester and in London, as far as his friends would allow, Mr. Emerson took great comfort in absence of responsibility and quiet, declared that idlesse is the business of age. I love above all things to do nothing. He said he never before had discovered this privilege of 70 years. Also that he finds there is a convenience of having a name, it serves one as well as having a good coat. He began to eat better than he had for a long time, and made long nights, saying, "A warm bed is the best medicine, and one gets such good sleep in this country, good strong sleep." At the table he said, The land of England desires much food in its inhabitants. When plans were made for him, he would smile and say, Old age loves leisure. Nevertheless, in this short stay, though he felt reluctant to go into company, he enjoyed in moderation seeing the sights of London. Mr. Norton, during the last year, as far as possible, had sunk his own sorrows in cheering Ruskin and Carlyle, both sick and utterly downhearted, and had made himself much beloved by them. Carlyle said to him, speaking of a letter from Emerson acknowledging the last volumes of the completed Frederick the Great, I have a letter received from him after a long silence, and though there were few words in it that did not give me pain, it says the only thing that has been said about my book that was worth saying, and therefore when I had read it through I wrapped it up in a piece of paper and put it inside the book. And there it will stay till I am dead, and it will fall into other hands than mine. This interesting sentence Miss Emerson, whose verbal memory was excellent, wrote in a letter to her sister soon after Mr. Norton's visit. It probably refers to letter C.L.V., January 7, 1866, of the Carlyle-Emerson correspondence, and yet what is said of the pain-giving words might well refer to the letter from Emerson preceding it, C.L. 111, September 26, 1864, referring to Carlyle's perverse hostility to the North during the war. The last letters that passed between them were most friendly. After staying but 1 week of chill and rainy November in London, Mr. Emerson and his daughter moved on to Canterbury, so attractive that he proposed they should send for Mrs. Emerson and settle there. However, after 2 days they went direct to Paris. There they had a happy week at the same hotel with Mr. and Mrs. James Russell Lowell and the charming Mr. John Holmes, brother of the doctor, whose acquaintance Mr. Emerson had made 14 years before at their Adirondack camp. In Paris they were joined by the admirable Swiss travelling servant recommended to them by Dean Stanley, without whose services their farther journeyings would have been spoiled by cares and difficulties thus avoided. They went thence by rail to Marseilles and Nice, and by boat to Genoa, and thence again by boat to Leghorn. Making but short stays at Pisa and Florence, they reached Rome on the last day of November. The weather was fine, they met friends, and had a special good fortune in being the guests during their last week of Baron von Hoffmann and his wife, who was the daughter of Samuel Gray Ward of Boston, Mr. Emerson's early and valued friend. Their villa and garden high on the Chilean hill were most beautiful and commanded a wonderful view of the Campagna and distant mountains. Under the Baron's admirable guidance they saw the ancient city to best advantage. Thence they went to Naples, and after 4 days sailed for Egypt. Christmas found them in Alexandria, and in the last days of the year they proceeded to Cairo. End note. This is the end of Journal Collection number 63, dating from the year 1872, when the author was 69 years old. Thank you for listening.